Today, we spoke to bikepacking expert Kurt Refsnider, who has a PhD in geology and wins in all three of the bikepacking Triple Crown events. As a professor at Prescott College, Kurt put two and two together and taught a class on geology through bikepacking, leading students on multi-day field trips by bike. He said its value comes down to the speed you move on a bike, with the right pacing to appreciate changes in erosion and fault lines. And he's admitted to a couple crashes from rubbernecking an interesting rock. Kurt is super friendly and approachable despite being one of the most competitive and accomplished ultra-endurance mountain bikers. He also co-founded Bikepacking Roots, ROOTS, a nonprofit that creates routes, ROUTES, and advocates for the sport. He is a business coaching endurance athletes, but if you're looking to just get started in bikepacking like I am, stick around since Kurt gave us his top line notes on joining in on the fun. Enjoy the show.
Good morning, everybody in Adventure Journal land. This is the Adventure Journal podcast. I am Adventure Journal senior editor and online editor Justin Hausman, and with me is the ed-in-chief, the head honcho big boss man, Stephen Casimiro. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Justin. Justin does so much that he has two titles. So yeah. That reflects how much we dump on the poor guy.
Also, podcast co-host is I'm working that one in for next time. But today I'm the head host, I guess.
Can we add social media prima donna? Could we add
sure.
that too? Okay. I got a long list of things that we could put on you.
You probably put prima donna about a lot of things when it comes to me, sadly. But enough about us. We have bikepacking guru Kurt Refsnider with us today to talk all things bikepacking, to talk about some of his absolutely incredible trips that he's done in the past, talk about the rise of bikepacking, to answer questions that might be kicking around in your head if you are thinking about getting into bikepacking or if you know somebody who is. Kurt's written a lot for us in the past about how to set up your bike, various kits you might need for various types of riding, and he's written some wonderful pieces for us in the print edition as well about some trips that he's been on. I profiled him maybe, 4 or 5 years ago, when he was putting together a really big route for his new organization called Bikepacking Roots. It was new then. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, welcome, Kurt. Thanks for coming on with us. Good to have you.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Stephen, for having me. Excited to be here and excited to put faces with these folks that I've emailed with so much about stories and teaching through the website over the years.
Yeah, we are real people, at least for now. Who knows? Eventually, you'll just be talking to AI bots about this sort of stuff, but we are real still. So if you know bikepacking at all, if you read bikepacking.com or the Radavist or any other like bike-friendly sites, you've probably seen Kurt. He's pretty voluminous in his writing about everything he's up to out in the backcountry on a bike. But one of the things I immediately thought was fascinating about Kurt, when I first met him, he was, or I guess met him over the phone. He was in this sort of transition period from being a geology professor at Prescott College in Prescott, Arizona, and I don't know if I'm sure I knew at the time. I don't remember if you were tenured or not, but I mean, becoming a professor is such a massive challenge. I myself fled academia after earning a master's, thinking I was going to go on to a PhD. It just seemed like too much work, and the job security seemed awful, and much better in media. I don't know why I thought that, but I ran, with my tail between my legs out of academia. But I can't imagine like finishing it, getting a job, which is the holy grail of anybody going into academia, and then I'm not saying you did anything bad, but then turning my back on it to be basically just a full-time bikepacker. But I would love to hear about your how you became a geology professor, and then why, what kind of changed your mind about that and got you into?
It's the money, wasn't it? It was the money.
Oh.
It was the money in bikepacking.
the lack of money in academia, maybe. No, there were a lot of factors, and it was definitely a very hard decision. Like, it was one I agonized over for a couple years.
I could imagine.
If that was what I wanted to do. And from a geology perspective, I've always been really fascinated by landscapes and like how the places that I spend time outside came to be. And that goes all the way back to when I was a kid, and I grew up in Minnesota, in the Minneapolis area, and was just fascinated by these glacial landscapes there from the big ice sheets that had come down from Canada time and time again. My dad had this super cool book that was, I forget what it was called, but like Ice Age Minnesota or something like that, that all these cool maps of like where the ice had been at different times. And I was fascinated by that, and had a really, really good earth science teacher in 8th grade that just continued to foster that enthusiasm I had for geology, and that carried through undergrad, and just continued on wanting to learn more through a master's and then through a PhD program, and got to do all sorts of really fascinating work up in the high Canadian Arctic on Baffin Island, looking at landscape evolution and glacial history up there, and climate change questions up in the high Arctic, where things are changing, 3 times or more faster than they are in the rest of the world in terms of like a warming temperature. And so that was just like a very natural progression for me of wanting to learn more, and seemed like just it sounds funny to say, but it was like the easy thing to do. Is like once you're kind of in that academic path, it's relatively easy to just stick to it. And like it's a hell of a lot of work to get through, and a huge challenge.
But it's a path. It's a very linear path where
exactly
one step follows the next. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really easy to get sucked in. Yeah.
Yeah. And I loved it. Like I loved the learning. I loved the way it challenged me and challenged my mind. And I was really lucky also to have advisors in my master's program and PhD program that were really supportive of all the biking adventures I wanted to do on the side. And, in some cases, like when I was a PhD student, money for my own like measly salary, the stipend that you get as a grad student, wasn't necessarily there for full summers. And so my advisor was like, yeah, if you want to go like race Tour Divide, be gone for a month, cool, that's great. That means we don't have to pay you for that month. And for me, that was like freedom to go do what I wanted on the bike. And so
yeah, we should mention Kurt was also won a bunch of races and was a sponsored rider. So I was I guess during your grad school experience too, which is amazing.
Yeah, it was. I feel so fortunate that my advisors were really supportive of me and like all the facets of what I wanted to be doing at that time, which was basically research and riding bikes. Those two things were
you have
basically life.
And you had a class, right? Like geology and bikepacking or something like that?
Yeah, that was once I got here to Prescott and started teaching at Prescott College. And so at the end of grad school, had that, well, now I need to go find a job, and was wanting to stay in academia. And I actually thought I wanted to stay more in the research track, but this really cool position here at Prescott College opened up, and it was just purely teaching position. And so I interviewed, pitched this idea. Like one of the questions was like, what's your dream course to teach if you could teach anything here? And it's already kind of a dream type teaching setting, because the school has this fleet of vans. They can get permits for public lands anywhere, basically. And so if you want to go take students for a 4-day weekend over there, or every Thursday, go, out in the field, you can. And they support that and encourage that. And so from a geology standpoint, that's like the best way to teach, is get students out in the field. And the geology in this region of the highlands of central Arizona is absolutely amazing and so diverse. So it was a really cool opportunity. And then I pitched this idea for a geology through bikepacking course that would be like a month-long class that we just ride through different parts of the Colorado Plateau region and southern, or the margins on the south edge of that, and basically march through the geologic history of the region at riding pace on,
amazing.
4 different trips. So we weren't out for a month, but like,
okay, I was just going to ask, well, that's a big commitment for these kids. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was like 3 or 4 days at a time.
I got to just say here that, my mind is reeling thinking about other classes that we could be doing, like
totally
nachos and deep powder skiing, or tube riding and cold beer. I don't know.
You can
this sounds like the most epic boondoggle class in the history of college.
Oh, it was a huge challenge to teach. And it was actually teaching that I started to work with Kate Boyle, who's now my teammate in the Little Pro mountain bike team we run. But she used to be in the academic world also in adventure education side. And so I had this idea for like the geology side of things, and I know all about bikepacking, but actually facilitating all of that in the field and working an adventure education curriculum into the course as well. That's what she brought to the course. And so we developed that course together, taught it a few times, which was so much fun and so much work. Like, it was everything about teaching that course was incredibly challenging, but hugely rewarding.
Any like bikepacking, like, I don't know, masters come out of that? Like, some of your students, do they get super into it now? They're beating you in races or anything?
We've had some that we had one that she went on and did a bit of guiding, like bikepacking guiding. after the course. We've had a few that have gone on to do some big long trips on their own that they had, never would have done that beforehand. Didn't have any bikepacking experience. Have had a few that have gotten into the bikepack racing scene since then.
So how did the bikes facilitate that? I'm thinking, I rode the San Juan Hut Trail, San Juan Hut system from Telluride to Moab, and that sense of understanding the landscape through the saddle. So can you talk about that? Like how does learning the geology enhanced by experiencing it on a bike?
It all comes down to the speed at which you move on a bike. Yeah. I mean, it's like, imagine if you were driving from place to place. And, I've done that with students on so many field trips, or been a participant in field trips where you load in a van, drive at 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour from one place to the next, and kind of stare out the window, and you see what's going on, but you have trouble processing it, or at least I did. And then you get to a specific location, stop, pile out of the van, look at stuff, point at stuff, talk about it, dig around a little bit, and you get to know the geology in that spot really well. And then you go and drive again, and you end up somewhere else, and you get to know the geology in that spot. But the difference, I think, with riding is that you're moving at a speed that you can digest and observe it everywhere in between 2 points like that. And if you're out for 4 days, and imagine there's like 30 points along the way that you're looking closely, you see it all in between. And, if you're hiking, you can cover, I don't know, if you were backpacking with a group, you might do 12 or 15 miles a day at most. And so it would take so long to cover a large area. And at bike speed, if we're bikepacking, we might be able to cover 30 or 40 miles a day at most with a group. But that's enough to get from one area, geology wise, to a pretty different zone potentially, and see everything in between, and see how it relates, and see the faults in between, or see the changes in the way things are being eroded. Or conversely, if you're in certain parts of the Colorado Plateau, like, the Canyonland zone, you can ride for 30 miles and literally trace one layer of rock all the way through that, and the ones above it and below it, and see like, ooh, those are completely continuous. And you might have 2 days like that. And then the third day you ride and suddenly they're not continuous anymore. And so then it's like, okay, what changed? What happened? What can we learn from this observation? And so I think it's just a super powerful way of being able to make those observations along the way. And, for me, that's inspired so many trips in the Southwest, where I know the geology in certain places really well. And there's these gaps in my mental map of what the geology is doing, that those will be places on my big map on the wall. I look like I need to go ride through there to see what's going on. So it's both kind of a personal exploration and one that works so well for, novice geologists that are out there to learn.
I was just going to ask if you've had other geologists reach out to you and be like, okay, I want to do this too. Like, this seems like a great, method of transportation, and just way more fun. Like
Kate and I both, after we started teaching that course and it got some good PR, we had geologists from other schools, we had ecologists reaching out. There were a couple people that reached out with more of a kind of like borderlands type, socio-political type interest in just using the bike as a means to connect places and teach about various subjects. And some of those courses have, actually there was one in from Texas Tech, Adventure Media, that they use bikepacking as a means of kind of a thread to try to tell the story and capture stories while out on bikes. And most of those students have never bikepacked before. So that course combines teaching backcountry riding skills and bikepacking skills, and then adventure storytelling through photography and videography.
So this is why college needs to be free for everybody all the time. I was just talking about this yesterday. Like, God, I would love to go back to school just to learn things, but also just to I would love to take this class.
Totally. Yeah.
There's no, I guess I could just ride that same route and,
you could, but it's
like
not
a geology book, but it's not going to be the same.
It's not the same. Yep.
But that's amazing though, to think about the bike as a tool for education and just, I'm kind of reminded, I can't remember this guy's name, but I heard him speak years ago at Outdoor Retailer. He was so moved by the big oil spill in Southern California in the 70s. I don't know why he chose to do this, but he didn't talk for like 20 years, and he wouldn't go anywhere unless it was under his own power, walking for the longest time. But what really struck me was how when he was giving a talk, so he talks now, but just about the how different the world is when you see it at human speed versus vehicular
Yep.
speed, and we've adapted to be able to go, 80 miles an hour or 400 miles an hour in the air or whatever. But like your sense of everything is so changed when you're walking or, riding 15 miles an hour on a
Yep.
bike or 6 miles an hour into a headwind.
Yep. It's totally true. And the interactions that you have with people along the way are so different also. That I think it's running it, whether you're, in a small town in the West or in some other country where you barely speak the language. It's somebody on a bike is really disarming. And, the communication, the conversations that can come up, I think when you just roll up and meet somebody like that, can be so genuine and so insightful. Whereas if we're, stuck in our cars or in an airplane, like you don't have any interaction with people in the place that you're passing through. Or if you do, it's just very cursory. So I think that's another really powerful element of moving by bike or foot. But bike especially, because you can just cover so much more ground and have those interactions along the way.
With your knowledge of geology, are you able to sort of, you always wearing your geologist hat when you're on a ride? Are you constantly like cataloging what that rock is and what?
It's always, it's there. It's fueled by a genuine curiosity and like wanting to understand the places I am and more about them. But then having been trained to just have that hat on all the time through grad school, and then with students who are always asking questions about things that you've maybe never actually noticed before. They have a way of probing unintentionally the things that you don't know, it seems like. And so just they taught me to be even more observant than I already was, especially when I'm in areas that are kind of familiar and it's easy to just kind of ignore some of those. Yeah.
Have you ever crashed because you were looking at a rock?
I was wondering that too.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Good.
Awesome.
I'm glad I asked. I was like, he couldn't have. He's too good on a bike. I'm sure. But
no, It happens. And actually, it's usually not looking at a rock. It's usually like when I'm riding on a ridgeline or something like that, and suddenly you have a big perspective of the bigger picture landscape and start like looking over your shoulder as you're riding and get a little too attached to trying to understand what's going on out there and not paying attention to the trail. And that's when you need to just stop. But sometimes I don't. And then it forces you to.
Yeah, I came very close to riding into the creek I was looking at over the weekend. I was just like, I'd never seen water there before. And I'm like,
you
that's
also
beautiful.
You hit what you're
I was pointing at it. I was aiming at it. Yeah,
so.
it was really. If I'd been clipped in, I probably would have gone over into the creek, but just enough. Yeah. So when you and I first chatted, you were just starting, I think, Bikepacking Roots, which is your is it? I guess it's a nonprofit, right? It's like a bikepacking advocacy group, route planning, all that sort of kind of a general beta dump, really, for anybody who wants to get into bikepacking. But I think you were just starting that, and you were just transitioning from being a professor. When you tell the college that you're leaving because you're going to just do bikepack, people must have thought you were insane.
Oh, it was kind of an odd progression because I think we launched, so Kate Boyle and I were the co-founders of Bikepacking Roots, and I think we launched the organization when I was on like a 1-semester sabbatical, and it took off remarkably quickly in terms of like members and people that wanted to be engaged in things and advocacy opportunities, because it was a whole new world that there weren't organizations that were paying attention to kind of the needs of the bikepacking community in terms of like trail connectivity and things like that. And got some big route development projects off the ground right away, like the Western Wildlands route, which was the one that we had chatted about, Justin, which is 2,700 miles, I guess, from Canada to Mexico. And so there's the Great Divide mountain bike route, which is adventure cycling's long route from southern Canada to Mexico. I'd ridden that and raced it a few times. And that's a phenomenal dirt road route that I think it's without a doubt the most impactful and influential bikepacking route in the world. So many people have ridden it. It's inspired so much. And it inspired the Western Wildlands route, which was a kind of a slightly more remote, slightly more demanding, but all, dirt road, Jeep road, non-technical riding. And also at the time it was during the Trump administration when there were so many attacks on public lands in, so many different ways. And so one of the goals of that route was to use it as an opportunity to educate people about public lands and, the different types, where they came from, why we have them, and some of the threats facing those. And so there's a big guidebook that we wrote for the Western Wildlands route that is all about like the logistics and the route, and then all these vignettes about some of the different types of public lands or the different areas that the route goes through and the management of those, and kind of the why of a lot of that. So it was incredibly busy right from when we launched. We were up to a few thousand members quite quickly. And so then I had to go back from sabbatical to teach again, and suddenly it was like, okay, this is too much. Like I was the founding executive director of the organization, and then I also had started a coaching company a couple years before. So I was coaching endurance athletes, endurance mountain bikers, and teaching and trying to get this organization off the ground, which went almost too well. And so it was pretty quickly a question of like, okay, something needs to give. What's it going to be? Oh, and I was also racing bikes on the side of all that too. So trying to train and do these long bikepacking races. And so I think it came at a time when the college, Prescott College, was facing some kind of financial challenges, and there were some changes going on. And, I think ultimately the realization I came to was that I loved the teaching side of things and really enjoyed that at the college, and the rest of the academic type position that you have at an institution like that was not what I wanted to be doing. And so after agonizing for like a year and a half probably over it, decided the right decision was to move on from the teaching. And by then the Bikepacking Roots organization was enough that I could actually get paid a bit doing that. And then through the coaching, that balanced things out well enough for me. And then it's like as soon as one door closes, another one opens, the saying goes. And then, it was like, okay, well, suddenly I have more time to train, a little more time to put into that. And it wasn't long before some of the relationships with sponsors like personal sponsors started to grow. And then Kate and I launched what we call the Industry 9 Pivot Pro Backcountry team, which is our own 2-person pro mountain bike team that's kind of focused on backcountry racing and backcountry adventures and backcountry trail stewardship. And that just took off. And so then suddenly it was like, okay, well, got Bikepacking Roots, got this, got coaching. And it was, again, like this question of, there's too much going on. And that took a few years, but ultimately I stepped down from the executive director position when it was clear that we needed something more like a full-time director rather than a half-time director, which is what I had kind of turned into. And so we hired somebody more at like 3/4 time, Allie Johnson, and we had her for a year. And then now the organization has Noelle Battle as our full-time ED, our first full-time executive director. And we have three part-time staff at this point. And so continuing with the route development side of things, and especially engaging the community more in route development, and really highlighting some of the fantastic routes that people around the country are creating just on their own, and excited to steward in the long term to make sure that they're really, really great routes and continue to be as things on the ground change. And then we've grown our education side of things tremendously. Kate's been running a free webinar series this past, 5 months or so, kind of over the winter, that's just kind of been walking through everything, how to bikepacking, from getting into it to route planning to thinking about like, okay, we're going out with a group. How do we set goals and communicate with each other ahead of the trip to make sure that the experience that we all have when we're out there is actually what we're looking for? And, kind of the full gamut. And those webinars have had like 700 people attending them,
wow,
which is mind blowing. Because if we had tried to run something like that, 6 years ago, we would have probably had like 30 people attending. And so I think that speaks to just the explosion of interest in bikepacking.
Yeah, and that's something I definitely wanted to ask you about. It really does feel like everybody's talking about it, and at least has been for the 5 or 10 years. And like bike touring existed before that.
Yeah.
But what do you chalk it up to? Is it just sort of people seeing it on social media? Is it like bikes have changed, or what do you think it is?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. Like I got into it back in the late 2000s, and at that point, like bikepacking, quote unquote, was very much like the racing side of things, and like the new bikepacking bags that were just coming out at that time, like Revelate Designs was really pioneering this new style of bags that were designed with single track in mind. It's like you can't really reasonably take a bike loaded with panniers and go ride technical trail and with a bunch of hike-a-bike and things like that, because the panniers literally just get in the way and the weight distribution isn't ideal for that. Rack and panniers is fantastic for on roads or dirt roads or something like that, but it's not the right tool and for off-road or on trail. And so there was this kind of mini explosion in the late 2000s of interest in bikepacking, very much from the like, okay, now we can actually go ride long single track routes and actually ride them rather than just push our bikes awkwardly on a bunch of it. And so that was when we saw the birth of like the Arizona Trail Race and the Colorado Trail Race, Grand Loop, like some of those very backcountry type bikepacking races. And, you know, there was, what else was there at that time? There was the Iditarod race on the Iditarod Trail in Alaska, which was actually one of the early or one of the first kind of quote unquote bikepacking races. And then the Great Divide, or no, what was it called? The Great Divide Race, which was replaced or kind of
for the Tour. Is that the Tour Divide?
Well, the Great Divide Race came first, and then Tour Divide kind of took over a few years later with some different rules and different route. But that was also one of the early bikepacking races, but very much a dirt road one, whereas those others were all single track oriented. So it was really cool to see how the evolution of just how you carry your stuff and a lot of the kind of ultralight backpacking technology making its way into the bike touring and the new bike packing type world. And that really opened things up, and we saw people doing all sorts of really cool kind of single track oriented stuff on mountain bikes with this new bike packing gear. And then fast forward like, I don't know, 5 years, and it seems like the pendulum has swung from bike packing being a very like single track oriented thing to now it being like, oh, it's how you go do multi-day stuff on gravel. And you see bike packing bags on, I mean, even people are doing long road tours with bike packing bags rather than panniers, which I don't actually think is the right kind of bag to be using necessarily for that, but it's what we're seeing. And so I think it really was suddenly there's this new tool, and the influence of the backpacking ultralight world made it so that people can actually fit what they need into a smaller package on the bike. And that just, you know, the less you're carrying and the less weight you have, the more fun it is. And so now if you can have a base weight for bike packing of, I don't know, like 15 pounds or 12 pounds or something like that, it's going to be so much more fun to go ride anything than it would be if you have like
the riding pounds. Is fun too. Yeah.
And so I think all of that combined, and then just the visibility from the ultra racing scene makes the sport more visible. Like there's more media coverage of that, even though in our surveying, the Bikepacking Roots surveying of the bikepacking community, like 1% of bikepackers are actually interested in the racing world.
Sure.
But the racing world, because of the coverage that it gets in the media, just means that it has a huge influence on the technology people are seeing. And so I think that's made a really big impact.
I think the boom in gravel has helped also, you know, because that's brought a lot of people to a new way of thinking about bikes, a way that maybe is less intimidating, less scary.
Totally.
You know, I think bikepacking.com has done a fantastic job of taking this and really kind of bringing some, I don't know, amplification to it. And, you know, the word that you guys both just used is fun. I mean, it's just, I did the white rim pulling a Bob trailer, you know, like like we've come a long way from how we used to have to pull things or carry things. And it's just so much more fun. In fact, one of our most popular ever stories on the website was bikepacking is running away for grownups. You know, I mean, it kind of feels like you're getting away with something in a way that backpacking does not.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you can cover so much more ground on a bike, and you don't need trail necessarily. Like you can just go link up dirt roads, which you can find so many places, I mean, anywhere in the country. to be able to put something together. And if you want a credit card tour and just go like motel to motel or Airbnb to Airbnb or whatever your style, that's another way of doing it. And it's harder to do that kind of trip on foot if you're backpacking. And then the other thing that really impacted bikepacking was the pandemic. And
well, like everything else.
like if you do a search on what is it, like Google Trends, like just a keyword search, and you look at the search history for the word bikepacking, it absolutely skyrockets during the pandemic. And I think a big reason for that was that all these people that had been, a lot of their bike goals are built around events, racing. And if those events suddenly stop happening, these people need something else to do. And a lot of folks realize that, hey, I can still have big adventures and have things to train for if I'm, go out and plan bikepacking trips on my own. And we also saw a whole bunch of pros at that time, like pro mountain bikers, pro gravel racers, whatever, that couldn't race. And so they were looking for other things to do. And suddenly they started looking at like what Kate and I have been doing for years, whether it's like chasing FKTs on long remote routes or just bikepacking. And they're like, hey, we can do that. And so you had this kind of explosion of media around bikepacking that was just like this mountain bike pro doing that, or that one doing that, or there's 4 of them going out and doing a big trip. And I think that really helped amplify the what opportunities people were seeing for, or what potential for adventures on their own with bikes.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll talk a little bit more about Kurt's sort of advice for if you do want to start out, and then touch a little bit on some of the big rides he's done in recent years. So we'll be right back with more Kurt Refsnider.
You love adventure, we love adventure, and that is why we created Adventure Journal in print. It is the gift that we've made for ourselves and for our friends, and hopefully for you, that is analog, that gets away from screens, that gives you some of the most interesting, deepest, and thoughtful stories from some of the best writers and photographers working in the outdoor space. We do 4 a year. You get free shipping and a deep discount. It's $60 to have this absolutely beautiful, no batteries necessary celebration of adventure in your mailbox. Get it at adventure-journal.com. I am drinking, it's gotten cold now because we're halfway through the show. I am drinking Long Weekend Coffee. We launched Long Weekend Coffee earlier this year to bring you and us blends that are not fussy, that will take any kind of brew method that we like, whether it's at home, in a cabin, on the tailgate of a truck, doesn't matter. We have 4 blends. We have dark, medium, espresso roast, and a decaf. I think they're pretty amazing. I guarantee you will like them. Check us out at longweekend.coffee.
Welcome, everybody. We are back with Kurt Refsnider, talking all things bikepacking. I'm sure when during our break you were out there researching Bikepacking Roots and seeing all the
no,
routes
they were
listening.
Together. They were all busy subscribing to Adventure Journal and ordering.
Well, people
coffee.
can have
just because we were on a break doesn't mean they're on a break. They had to listen to my pitches.
So Kurt, I feel like I asked you about this in the past, but so when I think bikepacking, like I have 2 bikes in my garage. I've still not gone bikepacking. I've been meaning to become a bikepacker for years. I have 2 bikes in my garage that are kind of there for that reason. Both of them are rigid frames, though. I have a rigid aluminum frame that's a flat bar gravel bike from Husky that I love, that I ride on single track all the time. And then I have a Kona Unit X, which we just recently reviewed, which is a steel frame rigid bike, which I adore. Both of which are loaded with bikepacking mounts. I mean, that's the idea behind these bikes. But correct me if I'm wrong, but you usually ride full suspension bikes when you're bikepacking, right? Or more often than not?
Yeah, but it's driven the decision and I'm very fortunate that I have a few different bikes to choose from: full suspension, hardtail, gravel, fat bike if it's for a winter type thing. Yeah. And I don't have a go-to bikepacking bike, quote unquote. I just decide what the best bike for the adventure I'm going to go on is. And I happen to, if you haven't kind of noticed so far as a listener, I love backcountry riding and backcountry trails and hard single track in the mountains. And so a lot of my trips are just built around that kind of riding. And so it almost seems like I'll take a hardtail on like rougher gravel routes that I'm doing that are more kind of training type rides, or ones where I'm just trying to cover big miles for one reason or another. And then most of my kind of, I don't know, big bikepacking goals are these harder backcountry trails. And so I end up on full suspension for that kind of thing. And full suspension's a little harder for bikepacking because it's hard. You don't have as much space for carrying gear on the bike, which is a big challenge. Smaller frame triangle. You can't put as big of a seat bag on there potentially. So
are you riding like cross country, like full suspension bikes, or like are these like big trail bikes, like 150 millimeters of travel?
I've got a Pivot Mach 4 SL that I've used for quite a bit of kind of longer distance bikepacking stuff that isn't maybe hugely technical or hugely steep, maybe is a better way of putting it. And that's a 120 millimeter travel bike. And then last summer I spent 3 months on the Continental Divide Trail, and that I rode on the Pivot Shadowcat, which is a 140 millimeter travel trail bike. So it's a legit longer travel trail bike. And
so like any bike can
phenomenal.
Be a bikepacking bike, basically.
Any bike can be a bikepacking bike. I think I wrote an article for you all years ago now.
Did. Yeah, that sounds familiar.
What was it? The best bikepacking bike is the one you already
the bike
have.
you already have. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
that's good advice for anything.
Yeah, that's a huge barrier in some people's minds of like, well, I can't really try bikepacking because I don't have a bikepacking bike. And it's like the reality is whatever bike you have will be the right bike if you choose the right route for it. And so, it's not to say like if you want to go ride the Colorado Trail and have a gravel bike, maybe not the right choice. But if you want to go do a big gravel route and you have a gravel bike, perfect.
So let's get a little specific here then. So whatever bike that you have, let's say you just want to try it out. You want to go one night,
That's the best place to start.
How would you go, like specifically what would you do? How would you get your gear on your bike? Because you don't need to go out and stock up on Revelate. You can, there's ways to like just go.
Yeah.
And so I think how would you just go?
The easiest thing to do, I think, for folks to try it is plan out a one-night route. It doesn't have to be big. I would encourage people like go somewhere familiar. Like if there's a ride that you do that's, a 30-mile loop or something like that, and camping is legal on part of it, cool. Go out, ride 15 miles out, camp, ride 15 miles back. And I guarantee you will learn a ton from doing that. It'll still be super fun, even if it's somewhere familiar. And it lets you try things in a pretty controlled environment that you know what you're getting into. And as far as like bags and gear and all of that, what I would say is like pick good weather so that you're not worried about needing to necessarily bring a tent and a bunch of waterproof clothing or anything like that. So pick a weekend that has a nice forecast. Head out. You can you can just strap a stuff bag to your handlebars with a couple long belay straps or webbing straps or something like that, and throw some gear in a backpack. And like, you obviously don't want to have a ton of weight in a backpack because that's just more weight on your butt, on your hands, on your feet, like all those contact points, and it's just not that comfortable. But if you're only riding for 15 miles or, a short way out, you can get by doing that and then putting some weight in your handlebars. And I'd say just give it a go like that. And it might not be quite the most comfortable possibility out there, but it's enough to give it a try and see what it feels like.
How much of your kit is bikepacking specific? I mean, like I have a couple bikepacking tents that I keep meaning to use, but I mean, you're probably just fine with regular ultralight camping stuff, right?
Yeah, you don't need, I would say the only thing that's really specific is
the
bags and the bike. Yeah. And not much else is. Like, I find that if I'm going to go backpacking, on foot, I'm going into the same tote of gear that I use for all my bikepacking stuff, and I just pull out shelter, pull out a tarp, whatever it is, same sleeping bag, same sleeping pad, all that stuff. And I think the biggest difference between bikepacking and backpacking is that on a bike, you're just more volume limited. You don't have as much space for things. And so I've found in some, like a Dyneema or Cuban fiber, whatever the name for it these days is, some of those really cool shelters that are super light, they don't pack down very small, unfortunately. And so they're not as well suited to bikepacking because of that. But pretty much everything else, if you have it for backpacking, it'll work just fine for bikepacking. And even clothes, like so much of what I have, my, Patagonia riding stuff, it's great for hiking in, or hiking clothes, great for riding in most of the time. And so I don't even necessarily have all that much different clothing that I bring for bikepacking versus backpacking, which I think is great. Like the less kind of exclusivity in terms of the gear that you need, the better, because it's expensive. It's, just more stuff if it's all different. So
Where do you usually store your copy of Adventure Journal when you're on
Adventure Journal? It's too
rides?
big. We need no, I don't. It's weird. I rarely bring anything to read on bikepacking trips, and I've brought books in the past with all the best intentions of like making some progress, and I find that no matter how small or big of a day, like as soon as I'm at camp and relaxed, my body just wants to go to sleep.
I was gonna say, you're probably way too tired.
You have the landscape to read.
It's
It's true.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, you're reading
That's
a
a good
story
point.
in the rock layers. Yeah.
Yep.
What about, so, when I'm, most of my backcountry experiences is like dispersed camping out, with my truck, right? So like my truck is loaded down with, recovery boards, and I have like battery chargers, and I have everything I need to like get me out of trouble.
Yep.
For the most part. And when I ride my mountain bike around my local trails, I have a tube, I have tire levers, I have everything I need to fix, basic stuff. But like, I'm wondering a bit about, people might be a bit intimidated by the idea of like something going wrong when they're like 50 miles deep and they have to carry a bike around. So, are there things that people should be thinking about in terms of like maintenance, like chain bike versus like a belt driven bike or one, well, I guess everybody's gonna be on a one by, but are there sort of things you can do to simplify the maintenance aspect or to take difficult maintenance issues out of the equation?
I think, like I've heard from so many people that a big stumbling block or barrier to getting into bikepacking is being concerned about fixing things if something goes wrong, or that, they don't have mechanical skills to do that, or they don't think they do. And I hate that that's a reality for so many folks. And it is, I think, the more you can do to learn basic bike maintenance, to learn how to manage basic scenarios that might come up on the trail, the better. But the biggest single thing I think you can do is preventative maintenance, and make sure that your bike is in good operating condition before you head out. And it's the better you are about that, or the better you are at having your local shop look things over, knowing what you're getting into, and making sure that everything is good. Your brake pads are in good condition. Your brakes are bled. Shifting or cables, housings all in good condition. That sort of thing. Like that sort of thing isn't going to eliminate all problems, but it's going to make it so much less likely that you are going to run into issues out there. And then when you do run into issues, it's more likely to be from you crashed and something broke, or that sort of thing, which,
because you're looking at a rock, you're looking at a pretty.
You're looking at a rock, looking at a creek, fall in, break your derailleur hanger, something like that. And so I think the preventative side of things is fantastic. Like I can't stress that enough. And then the other thing is just like keep things simple. And I think that's more. I don't know. So many folks I think this is one of the negative influences of the bikepacking racing world, but so many people seem to think that you need a dynamo front hub to generate electrons to charge things. And so then you've got your dynamo light and dynamo charger and everything wired together. And suddenly that's a whole bunch more complication and something else you're relying on that actually the more complicated it is, the more likely it is to fail. And so like I almost never use a dynamo hub. I've done like 3 trips ever that have used one, and the rest of the time just carry a little rechargeable battery to USB battery to recharge devices off. From an electronic standpoint, like rely on electronic stuff as little as possible, which I like bikepacking because I can get away from my computer and get away from connectivity. And, some folks navigate with their phone on their handlebars. That's the last thing I want, is my phone looking at me in the face the whole time I'm out there. And so just, the less I touch that, the better. And so that means less battery power, fewer electrons needed. So just keeping things as simple and basic as possible, it goes a long way.
So you just rode. I think you were the first. Correct me if I'm wrong. The first person to ride a bike on the Continental, like the Continental Divide Trail.
I wasn't the first. I was
the first.
I was the fourth.
Okay, all right. Close enough.
I was the first to ride at Southbound, which
okay,
not a big difference. Southbound. Canada, Mexico.
3,300 miles, something like that.
It depends on how you choose to go. But yep, my trip was 3,300.
So what's your kit? I mean, like when you start out, like, and did you have like millions of resupply points? I presume you were out there for 3 months, 400,000 feet of elevation gain.
Oh my God.
So how do you set something like that up?
And
So much.
what's your go-to snack?
Yeah.
Go-to snack. Ooh, so many hard questions. So yeah, for folks that aren't aware, Continental Divide Trail, that's one of the three big like cross-country hiking trails. There's the Pacific Crest, the Appalachian Trail. Those two are completely closed to bikes in their entirety. And then there's the Continental Divide Trail, which is like the least popular of those three. It's the most difficult terrain-wise, the most remote, fewest resupplies. And it's about 2/3 open to bikes, 1/3 closed to bikes. So like the national parks are closed, the wilderness areas are closed to bikes, and then there's a few other scattered public land sections that are closed to bikes along the way. And in 2013, I think, Scott Morris and Esther Haraney, a couple friends of mine, rode the whole thing for the first time and, blogged about it along the way. And I followed along, and it was such an impressive trip. And we're all like, okay, this is going to be the new big bikepacking adventure. Like everyone's going to want to do this. And I think it was a year later, Aaron Weinsheimer from Colorado rode it, followed exactly the same route that Scott and Esther did. And we're like, okay, picking up momentum. 3 people have done it now. And then no one rode it again. And it's just too hard for most folks to want to, I think. And I thought about it for years and years and was so intimidated by just knowing that it's 3 months of such hard trail. And it's like, it's hiking trail. It's not bike trail in most places, and so much hiking along the way. And so I finally last year decided or 2 years ago, going to be brave enough to try it, and started mapping it out. And Scott and Esther used a lot of dirt road detours around the wilderness areas, and I decided, for better or for worse, that I wanted to try to link together as much single track around the long wilderness detours as possible, which turned out those were actually some of the hardest sections of the entire route.
So you added more trail riding to what they
I added a
done.
bunch more,
Okay.
yeah, some of which was really hard and amazing, but really hard. So yeah, it was like 80 some days I was out there, and I packed, it was a challenge. Like, I want to be prepared because you're in the mountains, you're up on ridge lines a lot, like you're literally on the divide for a lot of the trail. And so the weather could be horrible up there, like super cold, super wet, and you're just exposed. And so on one hand, I wanted to be really prepared to be safe. And on the other hand, with that much climbing, that much hike-a-bike, and that much where you're like literally carrying your loaded bike on your back up stuff, you want the bike to be as light as possible. So my kit was, pretty similar to what a lot of the backpackers that were out there hiking the trail were carrying. I carried a tarp instead of a tent. They were all shocked that I didn't have a tent. And there were some nights in the northern half that I really regretted when I'm just being attacked by mosquitoes all night long. And, I had a head net and a tarp, and that doesn't do a lot to protect you. But that was one thing, super minimalist, hyper light mountain gear tarp that kept me dry when I needed it to, and packed down to next to nothing. I don't know, just ended up, a handlebar bag with clothing and a 20 or 30 degree sleeping bag, and seat bag that was a mix of food and a little more clothing, and a little frame bag that was all food, and a backpack that was my camera, which I didn't weigh until after. I didn't want to know, but it was actually a 2-pound camera setup, just lens and body, which was a lot to carry on that. And then the rest of my backpack was basically food. And there were a lot of sections that were I'd say on average, it was probably 4 days in between resupply points, which for a hiker isn't hard. Like,
right.
That's really manageable. There were some hikers out there that were doing like 8 to 10 days in between resupply points, but on a bike, your capacity is just so limited. I think the longest I had was like 5.5 or 6 days, and that was absolutely as much food as I could carry, space wise, on it.
Kurt, could you address the mental side? Because it's not easy to get physically fit. It's hard,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a relatively straightforward process. But the mental fortitude, like I was thinking about that when I edited your Iditarod story, and how cold it was. And, just like to stay in the game, over 80 days. Can you talk about what you've learned over the years, or any kind of, I don't think there's tricks, but like things that you tell yourself, to get through, like what's your mental kit that you pack?
Yeah. Well, I think that was one of the reasons that I was so intimidated by the route. Like, it wasn't the magnitude of it or how long it was going to take. It was that I wanted to be confident going into it that I'd be able to have fun for most of the time and be able to enjoy it. And I'm so impressed by people who can strike out on like huge adventures or huge races and be miserable the entire time and crank through it. And sometimes like win races that way, or, hike the whole Appalachian Trail or something like that and not really enjoy it. And that's the opposite of what I wanted. Like, if I'm going to invest that much time and energy into doing something, I want it to be a positive experience while I'm out there, not just after the fact, looking back on it. And I think it took a lot of years for me to figure out how to get into a headspace that I can just enjoy moving slowly, hiking speed with my bike through a mountain range all day long, or deal with deadfall that might be, 6 hours of hefting your bike over down tree after down tree after down tree, which is the reality on sections of the CDT. And I don't know. I think the physical standpoint, like being super strong so that the physicality of something isn't a limitation. I think that's something that was really important for me to realize. Like, once I get to a certain fitness point, then I'm strong enough that I can like set that part aside. I'm not worried about being able to get through it anymore. And I'm not worrying about being so exhausted that I can't function anymore. And then that allows you to devote a little bit more time to the mental side of things. And, for me, part of it is just like looking around and being able to enjoy where I am, or like see where I am, whether it's looking at the geology or just the beauty of it. And I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. And the more connected I am to the place I'm moving through, the more I enjoy it. And so there's this positive feedback with that side of things. As far as like when it does get hard, which it was so hard so many days, I think there's a few things that I would remind myself of out there that helped so much. Like, one, you chose this. Like, I knew exactly how hard the CDT was going to be. I've ridden a lot of sections of it over the years, hiked my bike over down trees, seen the certain sections that you're just like hiking and hiking and hiking. But also I know that it's worth it because there is, at the end of that, there's an amazing ridgeline that you get to ride, or, the fact that you can traverse this entire mountain range on the top. Like, it might not be super rideable, but there aren't that many ranges that you can be like on the range crest for miles and miles and miles. And so knowing what those kind of special parts are, and knowing that they're coming, and knowing that I value those enough that I'm happy to hike my bike, or happy enough to hike my bike for hours to get to it. That's something that is really important. And then a revelation that I had on the trail, which was a new one for me, was I found myself in the first half or first third really thinking about like the next town I was going to be getting to, and the place I was going to resupply next. And, I had this, you do this so often with planning logistics for any trips. You make like a little chart and be like, okay, I have this many miles between this town and this town, and this much elevation. I think it might take 4.5 days or something like that. And then I get to this town and I need food for X number of days beyond. And so it's the kind of the logistical framework for an adventure oftentimes gets built around those resupply locations. And so I found my mind was constantly going to those, and it was pulling my attention away from just where I was on the trail a little bit. And I think the more tired or more taxed I got, the more I started thinking about that next town. It's just, it's a comfort thing and a confidence thing that, once you get there, you have food again. You might have a restaurant. You might be able to get a motel, something like that. And it's comforting to know that that's coming in 2 days or 3 days, or maybe the next day. And I had this revelation that I wasn't actually there, wasn't on the trail to see those towns. Like, nothing against the communities along the way, but I wasn't there for those. I was there for the trail and the experience on the trail. And it took a little while, like a couple of weeks of trying to just completely change my mental perspective to just ignore those towns and like know that they're coming, know that I'll get there, know that I've like be confident that I have enough food to actually get to that next town, but to ignore it and just focus on where I was in the moment so much more. And it's easy to say, like, be present in the moment. But it's, I think the harder things get, the more challenging that becomes. And as soon as I made that realization that I was a little too fixated on towns, it made things so much more enjoyable. And it, like, I don't know, it helped me relax a little bit more, even when things were really tough. And I wish I had had that perspective or discovered that years ago, because so many of the long races I've done, you constantly are thinking about, like, I just need to get to the next town. Like, those are benchmarks along the way. And I think in bigger backcountry adventures, that's one of the oddities with bikepacking, is that you do bounce in and out of towns every few days, usually at least. And when you're hiking, you don't necessarily do that. You might be out for 12 days on a long trek and not go through a town at all. And if you're hiking something like the CDT, it might be 8 or 10 days between towns normally. But on a bike, you're kind of in and out of the front country a lot more often, even in backcountry adventures like this. So that was something that was really valuable for me to realize.
Well, Kurt, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic. Folks, Kurt wrote a piece for us in, I think it's issue 31. Is that right, Stephen?
That's correct.
About if you want to read more or hear more about his adventures from him, he wrote about riding the Iditarod Trail, and it's a fantastic piece. And you can get that on our website, adventure-journal.com, where you can also subscribe to read everything else that we are doing. But that's going to do it for us today, folks. And thank you for listening. Kurt, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.